Hello, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation today, hosted by employee wellbeing platform provider Frog Systems. Today, we're discussing what equity means for women in the workplace. We'll be looking at the challenges that women will still face at work, why the emphasis is about having equity rather than just equality these days, and what people of all genders can do to ensure women have the right support and opportunities to thrive in their careers. We're recording this conversation as we always do, and we'll share that with you afterwards, and we'll pop it on our YouTube channel as well. Embrace equity, of course, is the theme for this year's International Women's Day. And I'm joined by three guests who are dedicated to helping organisations break down the barriers for women of all backgrounds. Jennifer Amen Isakor is the founder and CEO of Above Difference, and Jennifer is an expert in cultural intelligence and supports leaders and managers across the public sector to make change happen. Rena Goldenberg-Lynch is the founder and CEO of Voice at the Table and works with teams and leaders to create more inclusive working environments. And Liz Prince is a business lead for games recruitment specialists Amicus and runs a campaign to change the gender balance within the gaming industry. If you have any questions for our guests, do please pop them into the chat, where you can also share your own experiences with us. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you, Jennifer, Rena and Liz, for being with us today. I'll let you tell people a little bit more about what you do and your backgrounds as we start the conversation. But I really wanted to kind of kick off by talking about this word equity. This is the theme for this year's International Women's Day. And I want to sort of really explore with you why that's so different from equality and what equity brings that equality doesn't. Jennifer, what would you say to that?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah. We can, yes, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful.
Jennifer was having a few technical issues in the run-up to us going live, everybody. But anyway, you're here now, Jennifer.
Absolutely great to be here. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, that focus that's shifting from equality, which is this presumption about everybody needing the same thing and treating all people equally, which is great in many ways, to actually equity, which is about really recognizing that we're all very different. And actually, it's less about what we think people need as opposed to really understanding what people need. I tend to, in my work, I actually go a step further from equality, equity to actually inclusion, which is all about creating new spaces in which we all understand what we all need. But I think what we know is that equality is not enough. Just treating everybody the same doesn't actually give us the results we want, because people are starting from different points, and we have to be really cognizant of what that means.
Rena, you obviously, you are very much focused on that inclusion piece as well as Jennifer. How do you explore that equity piece?
Yeah, so the equity piece is really noticeable when we hear statements like, I don't see color and I don't see gender. I'm treating everybody equally. And it's really missing out the point that not all of us are created or treated equally. So therefore, we need to compensate for that with fairness. And so the best example that I can give is a visualization is when, for instance, we ask different animals to perform one test. And the animals are a snake, a monkey, a goldfish, an elephant. And the test that everybody is asked to perform is to climb a tree. So you can tell that is equality, asking everybody to do the same thing. And equity is recognizing that the elephant's going to have a tougher time climbing that tree than the monkey.
And Liz, you work in an industry which is heavily sort of male dominated. So that equity for women piece is something that's inspired you to actually launch a campaign and initiative to get more girls to go into the industry, hasn't it? So you're seeing that from a very sort of black and white point of view, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and thanks for including me today. I think my perspective is always, I suppose, skewed to the very front end of a process, so the attraction and hiring of people. And certainly when I looked at the talent pipeline, or the diversity of the talent pipeline coming into games, and the way that the hiring was being done within the industry, it was really obvious that we just didn't have enough diversity within that pipeline. I think the equity move, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but certainly for me, why the focus has moved, or in the last few years, it definitely has moved from just equality to equity, is because of the way that we all experienced the same thing in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the way in which that experience impacted us and how we experienced it, even though it was the same thing, was in very, very different ways. So from a recruitment perspective, equity for me is that no part of a person's identity should get in the way of their ability to thrive. And I think the suffragettes were probably the biggest example, weren't they, of getting equality for us. But, you know, if you're visually impaired, just because you have the right to vote doesn't mean that you're able to, if you can't actually go and see the ballot paper. So just because you have equality definitely does not mean that you have equity.
Jennifer, I want to sort of explore that a little bit more with you, but you do a lot of work in the public sector, and obviously that pandemic piece that Liz was referring to there has struck the public sector pretty heavily. What is the situation that you see from then and now in the organisations that you're trying to encourage to give more equity to women? What are the challenges that you're seeing, and how are you trying to help organisations get over that?
I think one of the biggest challenges, Jane, is perspective taking, and that's the sort of assumption. And we've all seen that wonderful picture of people standing behind a fence, and you have one person who's got that complete overview across the fence, one person who's got slightly restricted view, and one person who's got no view at all. And I think the biggest challenge when it comes to providing equity is that where you've got the majority or the power base held with whoever can see over the fence, the difficulty they often have is understanding the perspective of the person who can't see over the fence. And so sometimes there's almost, I think there are a range of issues. There's almost like, well, there isn't a problem. What is the problem? It's really not that big an issue. You know, everybody can see over the fence because I can see over the fence, so why can't they? And so it's a lack of understanding of the barriers. And those barriers are so multi-level that even when you just talk about, the barriers for women, the barrier for, women from different backgrounds, the barriers from women from different races are different. The barriers for women with different levels of ability are different. And so we're constantly having to understand the perspective of people who can't see over the fence. And I think that's the biggest challenge. One, leaders in particular, I work with a lot of leaders, getting it, understanding what it feels like to be behind that fence and not be able to see, and whether that's a gender pay gap where you're being paid for doing less, being less paid for the job your male counterpart is doing, whether those are the barriers within the workplace because you may have taken time off to look after your children. Whatever those barriers are, they begin to create fences. And I think what I'm constantly saying to leaders is, listen, it's not enough that we provide bricks for people to stand on. We have to begin to take down the fences altogether. And that means really having a perspective of what those fences are, involving women much more in thinking about what an alternative world looks like, and having a real vision for what the world would look like, a shared vision if the fence wasn't there anymore. And I think those are some of the challenges. And we've really seen that with the pandemic, and just that sense of there needing to be more perspective taking. And that's where cultural intelligence really plays a huge part, because it actually makes people put on a different set of glasses and see the world through other people's eyes.
Jane, can I just add to that as well, Jennifer, as well as the perspective, it's kind of the self-awareness of that as well, isn't it? So, because I think someone was saying to me yesterday, that they were talking about their culture, and someone had said it's a very macho culture, and they were like, well, maybe, but I'm not saying they were offended by that, but they weren't not just aware, but they were almost like, I don't really accept that. Really? So it's enabling people to get through that sort of perspective and understand from a self-awareness perspective. And actually the way that we were talking about that was to then provide data. So there was a really interesting barrier that came out of that conversation, which was gender pay gap data. And actually things that hadn't shown up in the payroll were things like signing on bonuses, and ways that men in particular were incentivized to come into the business because they had the confidence to ask up front. So even though it might not have shown up in the everyday data of the payroll data, it was there because there was just that disconnect, I suppose, at the very start of the process. So telling somebody the problem or that there might be a problem with the organization, but then showing them through data seems to sort of meet that gap. I don't know, it's just interesting what you're saying.
Yeah, and Rena, you know, you were a lawyer yourself for many years in a very highly competitive industry and environment. And as Liz was saying, you know, the incentive to get people to work for you in the first place, and if those incentives aren't offered equally at the start, then that, you know, there is no equity to start with at the very beginning of a career. Oh, you're on mute, Rena.
Always happens. Thanks for the nudge. Yes, it's interesting that lawyers actually are almost on autopilot through most of their careers, particularly if you work in private sectors. So you get paid more or less equally depending on where you are on that ladder going up towards partnership. But what is noticeable and addresses the equity point is that the environment in which lawyers thrive is not necessarily conducive to everyone. It caters to a particular dominant type. And I read a great little analogy on that point where a professor who wrote a book called What If, and it's all about inclusion, a phenomenal book that anyone should read and everyone should read. And he starts out with a story where he wanted to stock his pond with this type of particular fish. So to find out exactly what will make the fish thrive in his pond, he went to an expert and got the whole lowdown, bought all the equipment, bought the fish, went into the pond, put the fish in the pond, and then took his time in adjusting the environment. And at first, the fish were great. They multiplied. They had a great time. But then little by little, they started dying out. And at the end, by the time he had completely forgotten to adjust the environment, a year later, all the fish were gone, these new fish. And I think it's an exactly the same kind of an analogy that we can use to environments that are not friendly to women, to people of different backgrounds, to people of different experiences. If we do not see that, or even if we know, this is the other thing, is actually a lot of organizations already know what needs to be done, but they don't necessarily get around to making it happen. And that's when you start losing the diversity that you had worked so hard to attract. And, you know, in the law, you start out with almost a 50-50 level of graduates or lawyers. But when you look at the top levels, at the partnerships, of course, they do not reflect those numbers at all. And it's primarily male, primarily white. Things are starting to shift now. I've been working with Voice at the Table for 10 years, so things are changing. But it's still, we still have a long way to go before we see true equity and equality at the top as well.
So if we look at the whole process, Liz, perhaps we could start with you. You're a recruitment specialist, so you're helping people to get into the door to the gaming industry. But you're also looking for talent for the studios that you work for, I guess, as well. So do you see a change in, or what's needed to change in that recruitment process to provide the right opportunities right at the start before even somebody's walked into the door of an organisation?
Gosh, I mean, there's absolutely loads and loads of conversation around that. The fact that, and there's tons of research, isn't there, that shows that women are put off applying from lots of different jobs because maybe the job spec is hugely lengthy. It might have lots of jargon in it, or actually on the flip side, it might be a tiny job spec, but it says you need 10 years of experience in exactly, this sector, etc. And that's one of the biggest barriers for us is this kind of the games industry needing and wanting experience of working in the games industry. And that means that generally we're moving talent around rather than bringing new and diverse talent into that pool. Definitely there's some things that studios, that we really encourage studios to do when it comes to things like job specs, is not to, obviously, to consider outside of the industry and transferable skills, because there's some amazing, in this case, amazing women who they could hire into those roles but haven't worked in the games industry. Something that Rena was touching on there in terms of the fish environment, but the way that we assess is also a huge barrier. I have a very personal example of a friend of mine who was made redundant. I'm a woman in my 50s, and as was she. It's not the best and most confident part of your career sometimes, and she saw a job advert that, I'm not kidding, she was probably the only person in Cheshire who actually was appropriate for that role. But in the job description, it said that part of the assessment was going to be a presentation. And she was like, no, I'm not doing a presentation. I can't do it. And not that that was appropriate for the job, by the way. So it wasn't a job that was going to be presenting. It was just that was part and parcel of how they did their assessment. And she deselected herself, as so many women do, before they'd even applied. So one of the biggest things that people say to us is, oh, but I just want the best person for the job. I'm like, yeah, but they're probably not even in your pipeline. They've already deselected themselves based on the things that you have either put in front of them in a job spec, you've made them mandatory. Your website then looks like you've got a load of bro culture. You have drinks every Friday because that's what you think everybody wants. And all of those things that make women drop out of your pipeline before they've even thought about it. The only other one of the other things, I'm sorry to bang on, but things like putting salaries onto job descriptions. 1,000,000% of me will tell you, please, please, please put salaries on job descriptions. People want them, people need them. If we are really serious about pay equity, then we will start to take that weird combative negotiation off the table when it comes to salaries, and we will offer what is right for the role. And we'll also stop asking people what they're earning today, because if someone, especially a woman, has been out of the industry or outside of the labour market because they've had other caring responsibilities and they're coming back in, then she won't be equitably paid as perhaps let's say a male counterpart in that case who hasn't come out of the labour market. And by asking, well, what are you earning now? It starts to already benchmark below where you should be offering. Jane, I could go on about this forever.
No, please do. This is what this conversation is all about. Jennifer, I mean, I saw you nodding and Rena there. This reflects a lot of the stuff that you're hearing, I guess, and particularly in the public sector, Jennifer. There are obviously probably a lot more women working in the public sector, I guess, and who face those barriers at different stages in their career, whether they've had to take a break for a reason and they're coming back into a job market that just doesn't speak to them potentially.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't agree with Liz more. I actually challenge people sometimes on whether they have a job attraction approach or a job repellent approach for certain groups. Because no, absolutely. Because I think there's there's language in job descriptions that's just absolutely repelling to a lot of people, and a lot of women, and particularly a lot of women from different backgrounds. And in many ways it reinforces a kind of old boys network, especially when you're looking at very senior posts, and then people are genuinely puzzled as to why they're not getting the diverse talent pipeline through. And you're absolutely right, Liz. I say the same thing. You sort of turned them off before they even got as far as the interview. I'm fascinated by a quote by George Day, and he says inclusion is not about bringing people into what already exists. It's about making a new space and a better space for everyone. And I think that's one of the real challenges with equity, that as long as we kind of try to make it, for women fit into what's worked when there hasn't been that equity, I think we're just going to keep going around the houses. And what we really need to do is say, what, if we were going to develop or devise recruitment approaches for the world we now live in, what would they look like? And I think they'd look very different from what we currently have in the public sector, in the private sector. I call it the sort of sticky plaster, soggy plaster approach, where it does feel like we're constantly trying to stick little plasters over cracks within the system, when actually sometimes we just need to be brave enough to go, let's just actually, let's take it apart and let's rebuild it. And we've been doing, sorry, I just finished, Liz. We've just been doing some really interesting work with some partners in Derbyshire who've been brave enough to do that, to really innovate, to really look at their recruitment processes through cultural intelligence and inclusive leadership, and actually go, why is that there? Why is that sense even there? And it's this thing of where we kind of cut onions because my mother cut onions because they cut onions that way. And I think we it's not that these people are being deliberately out to exclude anyone, but nobody actually has that perspective, that sentence in there that says, you have had to have had continuous professional development for the last 10 years. All right, that's offense, because actually if you've been out caring, then you haven't got that, or you've had. So absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, Liz. Yeah.
It's what you were saying there really made me go back to my friend's example, in that sort of there was no need to have a presentation in that selection process. It was there by habit, and also potentially to deselect, to repel. I love that. But one of the things I always say to people is, if you want to know how good Roger Federer is at tennis, you don't have a coffee and a chat with him. You ask him to hit a ball.
Absolutely.
And that's the thinking about your hiring process and your selection process that is completely appropriate to the role, rather than and also to the people that you want in that role. And having the bravery, Jennifer, is the right thing to say there. Having the bravery to make those changes, rather than to say, but we've always done it this way, or this is how 101 CV and interview selection goes. I mean, Rena, I know you do lots of work with organisations in that same way.
Well, I was going to bring Rena in there, because let's sort of move from the recruitment into the workplace, and that journey that a woman has in the workplace through, the early stage of a career, starting out, excited to be in the workplace, got the job, your dream job, hopefully, if that recruitment process hasn't repelled you in the first place. But then you've got all these different life events that happen to us through that journey. There's potentially marriage, having a family, menopause, older women returning to work. There's so many different things. So what are the fences that companies and our audience today need to be thinking about tearing down to help that journey be a better one, where you can thrive rather than feel like you're being challenged at every stage of your journey?
Well, I want to address that as well, and I just want to make two short points to what we were discussing before. When we were talking about organizations having the tools and not using them, and to the point, Jennifer, of job descriptions. Many of you probably will have heard of the Gender Decoder already, and I find the science behind it interesting, and don't understand why someone wouldn't use it. And that the science shows that, as you say, Jennifer, women might be repelled by, and women of different backgrounds as well, repelled by certain words, and they have done the science, they've done the research on those words. And if you pop in a copy and paste of your job description into the Gender Decoder, which is available free of charge to anyone who wants to use it, it will show you how many of the words and sentences are actually male coded versus female coded, as they call it. And the beauty of this is if you change from male to female, it will attract more women to your job, but it will not repel any men. It will not repel men. So why wouldn't you do it from that perspective? And still a lot of people do not. So that's one thing. And the other thing, talking about the public sector and the other sectors and how they are getting ahead, shall we say, with the promotion of women towards leadership. I was just perusing perusing is a strong word, shall we say, the latest gender gap report from the World Economic Forum, and there was some good news that we're now only 132 years away from gender parity, as opposed to 136 from last year. But the other observation they made is that we are actually doing better at getting women into more leadership positions. So, and this is obviously a global report. You can look at the regions separately. But the interesting observation about the leadership aspect was that we're making a lot more progress in the areas where women were more dominant. So the sectors like the public space that had traditionally more women in that sector, they are much better at progressing women to leadership than the kind of sectors that perhaps Liz and I work with, the tech sectors, the video game developers, the legal sector, etc. So again, there is something to be done here, and we're looking at the obstacles that you asked for about Jane, for the retention or the life cycle of a woman's career and all those things that are happening. So I am really pleased to say that a lot of organizations are becoming much more aware of the various milestones in a woman's career that make it a little bit more, shall we say, difficult in a normal or in a conventional type of environment to progress. And they are addressing it with maternity coaching and a lot more flexibility from parental leave perspective. There's a lot of education around menopause now as well. So there's lots more that has entered the market and company life to raise awareness of all of that. But where we haven't really progressed a lot is around some of these biases that continue to exist, and for instance, around the motherhood. The motherhood bias, which is so prevalent still in the market space, and that works against women who are mothers. So there is this potentially an assumption that when you're a mother of young children, you might not want to progress your career, or you might want to take a little back step from you're not quite as ambitious, you're not quite as committed. Perhaps you have split loyalties to your children and your job. So people treat you a little bit more less as a whole person, shall we say, a career-oriented person. So that's as mothers. But then women, for instance, who don't have children, have paid the same penalty, because if you don't have children, then you're viewed as slightly odd. And there is a penalty that you pay in that way as well, because people don't. There's this level of distrust that you can't put your finger on, but that's part of this unconscious bias that happens. And the flip side of that, the fatherhood bonus. So if you see a man who's dedicating time to spend time with his children, and he's going to their concerts and sporting events, that is very much recognized as an amazing thing to do for a father in the workplace, and men are lauded for it. So it's the opposite side of what women might get if they were to spend, as we do, spend time with our children. There is also with fathers, there is also a penalty that they pay for those fathers who want to be more hands-on, for instance, and take some more flexibility or flexible approach to their working or their career. A lot of men who want to do that feel that they are not able to say that out loud in the workplace because they will suffer, their career progression will suffer. So all I'm saying is a lot of these sort of biases in the system that exist for women equally apply to the biases in men. So if we can address equity for women, we will be also, in my opinion, doing a huge favor to a lot of men who want to do things differently as well. I'll stop there.
And vice versa, Rena, as well. If we encourage more men to take extended paternity leave and, actually take those caring responsibilities upon themselves as well, then I think that in turn helps women, doesn't it? Rather than, it's just still a societal context that the majority of the caring responsibility will fall on women. And I think through COVID, unfortunately, that massively played out, didn't it? But all of the homeschooling and just the extra impact on women through the pandemic was and is well documented. But absolutely played out your point, I think.
But I think also, sorry.
No, Jennifer, I was going to come to you actually, because I think, can we talk a little bit about what good practice looks like? What's a workplace that works for women and also for men? And Jennifer, you mentioned that some good work had been done up in Derbyshire with one of the organisations that you're working with. But I wonder if we can sort of talk about some of the good things that the people who've joined us for today's conversation can take away about good practice that they can take back to their workplace, peer support that they can offer to women in the workplace. What are the good things that are happening and what are the good things that we should be doing? And maybe, what does bad look like as well?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things that happened with the pandemic, for instance, and there were a lot of obviously awful things about it. But up to that point, we had assumed that you couldn't work from home with your family around you and actually do a good job. And I remember, if you remember the sort of furore that we had around the newscaster, and everybody was laughing because there was this person and this child running in and out when this person was trying to give a report, and it was, oh my gosh, oh wow, but actually by the time we got to the end of the pandemic, it was dogs, cats, babies, children, and everything on a Teams call, and absolutely that was fine, and people were still producing the amount of, in fact, better. And I've seen some interesting research recently that's been tested somewhere in the country, looking at a 4-day week. And actually the results from that in terms of well-being, in terms of, and I know, Jane, the amazing work you guys are doing with the Frog Media platform in terms of well-being, but we know that actually where you begin to create new workspaces, whether that's looking at things like a 4-day week, whether that's allowing people the flexibility of wrapping their wrapping their work around their domestic circumstances and being okay with that, whether it's a child being in the background of a Teams call or a Zoom call, not a sort of indication of a mother's inability to manage and balance her home life with her work life. And I think where we begin to recreate these spaces and challenge some of those assumptions and biases, then we're not just seeing more equity and more inclusion, but the bottom line is, the science and the data is telling us that companies are doing better. The statistics that came out of the 4-day week are pretty startling in terms of output, in terms of, what productivity and well-being. So I think good practice has to come back to that quote by George Day, that this is not about women fitting into male-dominated spaces. And this is also not just about women being a homogeneous mass, because we know that whatever barriers women face generally, Black women, women with disabilities, face double those barriers, or in some cases triple those barriers. But this is about organizations being brave enough to take a step back, to reinvent, to recreate, to co-produce, to say, okay, how do we do this now? What does the world look like? And what's it going to look like for us now? What's it going to look like for young women from Generation Z and millennials and who have different expectations of the workplace? How do we begin to recreate spaces that are not about us trying to, as I said, smooth the cracks over, but actually say, could we have workplaces where we work with the assumption that there are caring responsibilities on both sides? Could we have workplaces where we work with the fact that actually, if you have to drop your children or have your carers and do what you need to do and come to work in that time, you're still going to be as productive? Could we have workplaces where we don't make decisions based on whether you've had continuous professional development for the last 10 years? Because we actually understand that if a woman's been, and I know not all women have children at home, but if a woman's been managing her home and doing all of that stuff, she's got a lot of skills that are transferable, that may not have been learned in a training course. And I think that's where good practice will really begin to emerge, when we're courageous enough to do that. And we also are about co-producing solutions as opposed to trying to impose those solutions.
I think from my perspective, Jennifer, innovation is the absolute key, isn't it, to moving us ahead. And some of the conversations I've had over the last few years have some organizations have been so desperate to go back. Could we just, pre-pandemic, it worked for us. We were all in the office 5 days a week. I knew where everyone was. I understood productivity. And even, I'm trying to think when it was, we did a panel discussion at a conference last July on the 4-day week. And it was when the 4-day week pilot in the UK was starting. I think it was started in June. It's just finished. And we had a games company who was part of that 4-day week trial on the panel. And even after that, so only, a couple of years into the pandemic, an HR woman said to me afterwards, I've still got emails from my hirers saying, but when are we all coming back to the office? And when is it going back? And that acceptance that the world, not just everything has changed. Everything. Candidates' mindsets, workers' mindsets, so many people dropping out of the labour market because they don't want a part of it anymore, or perhaps they're on a waiting list for NHS treatment that has also been impacted. So many things have changed that if we just think that we can rebuild the way it was in 2019, then frankly, more fool those organizations. Some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of innovation, Jane, thinking about the good practice, how to not just trying to recreate culture. So, let's have a meetup somewhere because, we need to keep our culture going. It's all lovely, but it's actually how to make sure that equity is within our business when it comes to representation. So if you work at home and there are people working in the office, how do you make sure that, or how does your organization make sure that you have the same opportunities, not just in your work, but also in your promotional criteria? How do you make sure that, or how does a company make sure that you have those same opportunities as somebody who's perhaps more present, perhaps, God forbid, a few times on the golf course and you're not? How do you create that within organizations to make sure that there is true equality and equity of opportunity for everybody across your business? And that only comes through innovation, not through going back to 2019 and how it was then.
Rena, it's that sort of suspicion over productivity, isn't it? If you're not seen in the office, you're obviously not working very hard, and that people have got to get over that. That we just can't carry on with that kind of attitude, can we, in terms of management?
Yeah, it's absolutely that, Jane, and Liz. To your point, it seems to me that we always progress 2 steps forward and then take a step back. So it's unfortunately not a linear progression. And of course, we've been talking about this topic for much longer than I've been talking about it myself. And this change is difficult to achieve. But to the point of what is good practice, what I've noticed is organizations that take themselves a little bit less seriously, that where they treat everybody as a human with a little bit of vulnerability and humility, that's when it becomes easier to flex that empathy muscle and to understand that different people have different challenges, and how do we address it for all of them so that they can all swim in the pond and thrive, and bring us the good solutions and the innovative, creative ideas that we want from them, from their experience. So it's really coming down to the human level, where there is no expectation that you leave your emotions behind at home and you come in and you perform a role that is completely foreign to us as human beings. It's marrying the entire human as you come into work and perform your role, whatever it is. The other thing that is good practice that I've noticed is, I always believe that organizations have all the answers. Organizations are full of clever people, and when they are challenged with a business challenge, somehow they always come up with a solution by gathering people and gathering ideas. And yet with these challenges, the diversity and inclusion type challenges arise, they don't have any solutions. So one of the things that I've noticed good companies do is when they notice that there is a cliff somewhere. So for instance, let's say in law firms, promotions are going on well up until a certain level, and then you can see that a certain group of individuals or people are falling off, or not progressing, or stuck, or leaving. Then the natural question will be, why is that? It's not because we already know, it's not because women check out, they don't want to work anymore, they want to look after their family. It's because there is a bias in the system, and then it's a matter of simple research. Try and understand what is the bias, where is it, and how do we address it. And when companies actually do it, they always find the solution and always address it. So that's another good practice. And you asked about perhaps bad practice. I would say the organizations that maybe don't get it or don't see it as an important part of our future as business, as part of thriving in the future, when they do it haphazardly, when they just do it to tick boxes, or maybe just to appease either a client or a client group or an employee group, that's when progress will not be made. That's when, because it has to be led properly from the top, with the commitment and the understanding of what you're getting back from your diversity, from your initiatives. So when you do it, a bit here and there, you're going to be spending a lot of time, a lot of money on things that are not going to give you the results that you want from diversity and inclusion.
So as we wrap up this conversation, because I'm conscious we've been talking for quite a while, and thank you everybody for listening in. And if you do have a question that you do want to ask, get it in quick. I've got a couple already that have come my way. We agree that equity was important for that fight for talent, then basically, and so could we maybe round off by each of you with some advice for the people that have joined us today as to, what would you be your top piece of advice for them to take away from this conversation about encouraging and promoting equity within their organisation? Liz, perhaps I could start with you.
Yeah, I guess my focus is always, I suppose, at the start of the pipeline. So everything that we've spoken about in terms of thinking about your job spec, thinking about how you look from the outside in, how you're demonstrating your commitment to diversity and inclusion right from the get-go, even if you are, certainly from a games industry perspective, a 10-man team, an actual 10-man team. How do you show your commitment to diversifying your studio and your business, and really communicating that all the way through your job descriptions and your process and how you treat candidates? I think some of the things that we've talked about in terms of selection, really, really trying to think like innovatively about how you're going to assess people for those roles, not just thinking, oh, quick, grab the CV, they're here, but really considering bias through the interview, who they're going to meet with the interviews, through the interviews, and how you're going to help them bring their best self to that interview, rather than the combative, let's try and repel you. I'm going to use your word, Jennifer, how I'm going to repel you out of our process. And probably the final piece, if I may, is just to really think about how can I make this person be successful, because that's great for me and it's great for the candidate. So asking the candidate what they need when they're coming to an interview. We use an example of a lady who said to me, I've got Asperger's, so I'm going to have difficulty with social interaction. I'm going to have difficulty reading facial expressions, and I won't be able to maintain eye contact. Now, had we as an agency not championed her through that process and given the information to the client, and the client hadn't bothered asking themselves, they may easily have deselected that individual through lack of communication skills or whatever other sort of phrasing they might want to use. So asking people what they need to be successful through your process will help that be the genuine two-way selection process that it should be.
Thanks, Liz. That's brilliant advice. Rena, how would you sort of follow that up as you take people through the workplace?
So for the each one of us in the workplace, I have an acronym which I'll leave with you, which is NIP, as in nip bias in the bud, and the N stands for notice. So if we see or observe a situation or hear a statement that has an assumption built into it, let's notice it. The first thing is noticing. The I stands for inform. So then let's get into a conversation about this. Let's see if there's a polite way of pointing it out, or somehow educating on this, or getting into a conversation that actually informs about what is it that I've noticed, how is it landing with me when you say something like that. And the P is for pay forward. And that's about recognizing that we are all biased and we might be saying and doing things that are not so good for others. And so we need to do that self-awareness exercise. Or is there anything that I'm doing that might be landing in an unintentioned way? So notice, inform, pay forward. Those are the things that every single one of us can do.
Brilliant. And Jennifer?
Yeah, I think that 4 quick things I want to say. One, I think this is about leadership. It's always about leadership. Everything rises and falls with leadership. And this is about leaders who are committed to this agenda. So, and it's also about leaders who take time to think about what the preferred future is. I think that, you know, I'm in love of Nancy Klein's work on time to think. And often we're so busy trying to run organizations, so busy to sort of patch things up along the way, that what we often don't do is take time to think. And I think she says something, and I'll paraphrase, that actually the quality of our solutions is you know, completely relevant to the quality of the time we take to think. And if leaders do take time to think, then what comes out of that is the need. And I often say this to leaders: what's your vision for inclusion? So if your organization was an organization where there was equity, there was inclusion, what would it look like? Because if we're actually trying to get people to shift and move away from these, what have been quite male-dominated spaces, to spaces that are much more equitable and fair for women and for women from all backgrounds, we have to have a vision of what the destination looks like. And I often feel we're trying to pile people onto the bus without telling people where we're trying to go, or people being really clear of what our preferred future is. So what would the world look like? Because I think if we start painting a picture of that preferred future and everybody sees themselves in it, men, women from different backgrounds, then actually there'll be a lot less fear and resistance around, because people will see that this is a world that could be a good world for everyone. And then the final thing I would say is that this is, as much as I think it's a leadership thing, and one of the things we say in Above Difference is that when leaders lead well, they lead all people well. And actually, I encourage people not to think of EDI as being over here and leadership being over here. If you're not leading the men and the women in your organization well, then actually you're just not leading well. So this is a leadership issue. But I also think there's something about us encouraging all of us to be the leaders that we want to see or we want to be led by. And we all have the opportunity to make sure that our workplaces are equitable, that we recognize the challenges that different people face, and that we're doing something. And each and every one of us can do something to embrace equity. And that's why I kind of love the hashtag for International Women's Day this year. Let's all embrace equity, because I think that's it.
Well, let's just end then on a question that we have actually about that embrace equity. I know there's been some sort of talk on places like LinkedIn as, oh, it's all a bit fluffy and a bit woolly, and embracing people doesn't really talk about, you know, the real issues about equity, which is about, you know, pay inequality, and all these companies coming out and saying we celebrate International Women's Day, but actually we're just glossing over all the inequalities that within our organisation. Is there still a relevance for International Women's Day, do you think, Jennifer?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a relevance for all of these things. And, you know, we often have the same debates when it's Black History Month. Is there still a relevance for them? Yeah, because I think whatever it is, whether it's this, whether it's International Women's Day, it gets the conversation restarted. It means we re-inject, you know, life into the conversation. And even if it's 1 month, 1 day, 1 week, that starts off a sequence of events that continues. And I think the onus is on all of us to embrace the months and the days, but also to keep reiterating the message in all the work that we do. So yeah, I think there's a relevance for it.
And Rena, Liz, do you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I just wrote a blog about this because, you know, it's like it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We cannot get complacent on this. You know, numbers will roll back. The evidence that women are progressing is going to roll back if we do not continue on this conversation every year, every day.
Rena, what was it, 132 years now, and we're celebrating that because we've knocked 4 years off it.
Exactly.
Let's hope we're not all here in another 132 years.
Unless there's some sort of cryo-freezing thing, that ain't going to be on.
Can you imagine 10 years ago having a conversation about menopause?
Yeah.
No. And
exactly.
That's true.
But you know what? We are making progress.
We are making progress.
And do you know what, Jennifer? Some of that, in my mind, has come directly because of the pandemic as well. And that kind of the fact that our homes and our working life have been so combined, haven't they, for the last few years? And I felt it was really noticeable, even with people I've worked with for more than 10 years, their openness and their difference after all of that experience was dramatic, actually. So they all hear about my menopause journey, whether they like it or not.
Let's have that conversation another day, shall we? And it's definitely a subject that we talk a lot about in the work that we do. But listen, thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll be sharing this recording with you. And if there are colleagues at work that you think would do with listening to this conversation, then please do share it with them afterwards. And thanks to those of you, for those of you who are subscribers to our employee wellbeing platform, we'll be adding it to the broadcast section so that you can watch it back and share with any colleagues who you think it might help. You can find out more about us, Frog Systems, by going to our website. Our digital platform provides video content and expert advice for employees and managers about mental health, well-being and inclusion, and topics like the one that you've heard about today. Do connect with us and follow us on social media for updates on all the work that we do in this space. Thanks once again to my 3 fantastic guests, Jennifer, Rena and Liz, for sharing your insight and expertise with us all today. And thank you very much for watching, and do enjoy the rest of your day.